This week, Donald Trump has brought an end to globalization in a move which has absolutely smashed the global economy. This is the S&P 500 today, which, for anyone who is not a person who knows things about stocks or the stock market, is a index of the 5 largest companies in the US. Various different indexes pick kind of different companies to be part of their kind of listings. Dow Jones is a little bit more, tends to be more kind of manufacturing things. S&P 500, as I understand it, is kind of just the biggest companies in the country. The Russell 2000, I think, is smaller. The smallest 2,000 stocks. Here we go. Says in the about. How are all these getting on? These are all down as well. I mean, it's kind of hard to find any which have had a particularly good week. But these stock market crashes haven't just been confined to the US. If we look at the FTSE 500, it's not been a great week either. This morning we have an 8% loss in the Nikkei this morning. And all of this market turmoil is a result of Donald Trump's implementation of sweeping tariffs on countries across the world. Large countries, China, for instance, small countries, the tiny islands full of penguins, which have also had tariffs, friends in Europe, Canada, Mexico, and also enemies, in particular China. It's hard to get across the extent to which this is just a complete tearing up of 40, 50 years of the foundations of how global capitalism is supposed to work. For some decades, the kind of guiding light of global capitalism has been this idea of globalization and free trade, right? The idea that if we take away barriers to two countries trading with one another, that will be beneficial for both those countries. There's an idea from David Ricardo, an economist from 18th century, who had this idea around comparative advantage. This is the idea that if two countries are trading with one another, or multiple countries are trading with one another, there are certain goods that it is best for them to produce because they have various different advantages. They might be natural advantages in terms of good soil for certain plants, or good climate for growing certain things. They might be sort of human advantages in terms of cheap labor or really good education. And broadly speaking, the idea is that if you have relatively free trade between multiple countries, all of those different countries can focus on producing the things that they can do the best and also the most efficiently, right? The cheapest. And the specific idea around comparative advantage is the idea that even if one country could produce something cheaper than a different country, if there is another good that they can produce even cheaper, that it is still better for them to produce that good, right? So if the UK could make baked beans for cheaper than France, and yet it could make cars even more cheap than France could, it still wouldn't make baked beans because cars would be better. That's my terrible explanation of comparative advantage there. But broadly speaking, the guiding light of contemporary capitalism for many decades has been like free trade, right? That has been the key word of politics across the aisle, really. And so the turnaround that is represented by these quite high tariffs is significant. The the extent to which free trade has been such a big deal, is evident in the fact that most of us could probably name at least one trade deal, right? Whether it's the World Trade Organization, whether it's the European Union, which part of that is a trade deal, whether it's NAFTA, right? TTIP was the kind of proposed deal between the EU and America. But these are quite boring negotiations in some regard, and yet they are so important that they are kind of terms which have entered popular conversation. And yet, Trump has decided to kind of tank all of that in an attempt effectively to bring manufacture back to America. Trump has been a long-time critic of free trade. Back in his first term, he was a big proponent of tariffs on China already. We saw his tariffs on washing machines and on solar panels, both of which the Biden administration carried on, it's worth saying, and extended in the form of the CHIPS Act. And so I'm going to come on to Seattle in a moment, because, Trump has been a long-term critic of free trade and globalization. For a long time, the key critics of globalization have been on the left. In the chat, Saxolotl is mentioning the WTO protests in Seattle and in 1999. So it's part of a big movement. So the third meeting of the World Trade Organization, which, for anyone who doesn't know, the World Trade Organization, to my mind, is, for some years, was almost the world's government to an extent. It's always kind of suggested to us that the United Nations is really important, but the World Trade Organization has teeth in a way that the United Nations doesn't, and for many decades kind of existed to oversee global trade. And effectively, countries wanted to be members of the WTO because it gave access to one another's markets. Effectively, if you joined the World Trade Organization, you said to all the other countries that were members that you were going to reduce tariffs, in many cases sort of get rid of all tariffs. You were going to promise not to subsidize industries within your country. You were going to kind of make sure you had some regulatory alignment with all the rest of the countries that were part of this, part of the WTO. So copyright was always a really big thing, intellectual property, because many countries, or many kind of less developed countries, maybe didn't have the same stringent intellectual property rights systems that countries like the US or European countries had. And so the World Trade Organization, kind of, if you wanted to be a member of that organization, you were forced to have those same rules. And the World Trade Organization was always quite a controversial organization, right? Because in theory, it was a way for all of these countries, and it was increasingly most countries in the world as time went on, to kind of come together, to kind of hash out shared rules on global trade, to make it easier for each other to trade with one another. But in practice, it was a way for the United States to impose rules which benefited itself and other wealthy countries onto poorer countries. One aspect of Trump's ripping up of kind of decades worth of norms around globalization and global trade, one of the key hypocrisies is the fact that the US and its allies had kind of designed all the rules themselves in introducing tariffs Trump is effectively nuking a system which was set up precisely to benefit the US and other wealthy countries like it. So the World Trade Organization was often, back in the day, a really controversial organization for several reasons. One reason was the idea that generally placed the interests of corporations above the interests of people. So the trade deals which were hashed out by the World Trade Organization, it was all about letting companies and investors from different countries kind of access markets in each other's countries or invest in one another's countries, rather than being about ensuring that people across the world benefited from better education and better infrastructure and all that kind of thing. And so, kind of broadly speaking, in the most simplistic way, the model was that, or one of the key benefits of this model was that more and more kind of manufacturing jobs that were maybe not always super pleasant to do could be effectively farmed out to poorer countries, whilst all the kind of respectable white-collar jobs could happen in wealthier countries. The example I often use to explain the way in which globalization for many decades has been the fact that, it doesn't say it anymore, but on the bottom of iPhones, and I think it still does on the back of MacBooks. I have a MacBook here. This was not for... Okay, this Apple MacBook on the back has the sentence, designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. And when we talk about globalization in the kind of modern sense, that was the kind of model which the World Trade Organization and other kind of trade deals were usually meant to enable, right? Wealthy countries which had reasonably good levels of education and which had lots of kind of money hanging around to invest in startups and companies could launch big companies like Apple and do all of the kind of intellectual work in New York or California, London, but kind of push out all of the dirty, grittier, harder work out to places like, at least during the 2000s when it joined China. I'm trying to think of, and so it was always kind of a controversial model. This is footage someone mentioned in the chat a moment ago from the Battle of Seattle, which is a big protest at the third, I think, meeting of the World Trade Organization, where activists in the US kind of descended upon the meeting and effectively shut down Seattle. It was like a really successful protest. Huge numbers of people kind of descended into kind of altercations with the police, and was kind of like one of the key left-wing moments of the 90s, right? I would say probably by the time you get into 2000s, a lot of kind of left-wing activism is sort of anti-war activism. Like, that seems to be the kind of locus of activism. So another aspect of all of this, was that, it was all about how can, when a slightly poorer country, for example, joined the World Trade Organization, the emphasis was always on opening that country up to investment from American companies who could go in and maybe buy up utilities or open factories there. And that was very much the focus. And kind of the key call from protesters such as those at the protests in Seattle was always like, yes, there is something good about globalization in the sense of, global cooperation is good, but the way in which organizations like the World Trade Organization kind of did that was very one-sided. Because for poorer countries, there are really good arguments for tariffs, right? We are, over the past few days, and I'm sure for many more days, we are going to be hearing a lot of negative things about tariffs, and certainly the way in which they have been implemented by the Trump regime is, like, at best, silly. Effectively, Trump has just done wide, sweeping, broad tariffs on everything. How they tend to be used is that, and can be used in ways which are more positive, is if you are a developing country, for example, and you have the potential to be really good at producing steel, for example. I'm only really picking steel because, I don't know, it's a thing that people talk about when they're talking about tariffs. Then that potential isn't always super useful if you're freely trading with lots of other countries, because what happens is that you have other countries who are already very good at producing steel and can do it they can make it much more efficiently. They have kind of mature industries who can pump it out, and therefore, even though you might have the potential further down the line, for whatever reason, to produce steel cheaper than those other countries, that potential industry, sometimes called an infant industry, will never have the time to develop because, everyone within your country is going to buy steel from other countries, and therefore kind of that potential is wasted. So generally what happens is a country will go, okay, we're going to focus on that particular thing, and we're going to have a tariff on steel imported from other countries, which will increase the price of buying steel from other countries within your country, right? There's been lots of kind of gotcha videos that I've seen on the internet of people explaining to Trump voters that if you put a tariff on China, for example, it's actually American consumers that pay the tariffs, right? So this was a big one on washing machines when Trump implemented tariffs on those. People thought that China were going to pay the tariffs on washing machines. Actually, it makes washing machines in the US more expensive. And that is intentional, right? Because in our sort of steel example, it causes a situation where companies within your country are more likely to buy steel from the kind of developing infant steel industry in your country, and that's going to give that industry a chance to get better at doing it. The cost of steel produced within your country is going to go down, eventually to the point where it can compete with steel companies from other countries, maybe even to export, and you can get rid of that tariff because you've allowed that industry to grow up. One of the real kind of injustices of the World Trade Organization model of free trade was that it forced poorer countries to drop any tariffs that they had. So it meant that they weren't able to use tariffs to allow themselves to build certain industries which they thought that they could be good at, and effectively just solidified Europe, America in particular, as strong economies who, when other countries joined the WTO, could kind of use whatever advantages they already had to effectively keep those poorer countries poor whilst continuing to kind of solidify their place as wealthy countries. And it's worth saying that most countries that are wealthy today have at some point in the past used tariffs themselves, right? So America very sort of famously did for many decades to get to a point where it could compete with Europe, for example. The big turning point for the World Trade Organization was when China joined in 2001, sorry, which was a long process, right? So for a long time, China kind of didn't want to trade with the rest of the world, right? It was WTO was kind of the club of global capitalism, and so why would it want to get stuck in there, right? But there was a long process in which China kind of negotiated becoming a member of this big trade club. And, I mean, this is a kind of telling title here. And one theory was that, because in many regards, China maybe seemed opposed to both the economies and the politics of all of the countries that were already members of the WTO. But broadly speaking, the hope was that if China could be brought into the fold of the World Trade Organization, that economic liberalization might encourage kind of political liberalization. And in particular, so there was a couple of things that particularly American, but companies that were already in the World Trade Organization wanted. One was the ability to access cheap labor from China, right? The phrase "made in China" became that's like a whole thing, right? But also they wanted to access a massive market. Part of the reason, so it took China a long time to join the World Trade Organization, because there are all kinds of stipulations in terms of joining about how much, about what tariffs you charge to other countries, but also, you're not allowed to provide too much kind of, the government can't provide too much support to certain companies within your country. You're sort of not meant to subsidize goods that are going to be sent to other countries. You'll see a lot. There's been a bunch of disagreements between China and the EU in recent, at least in sort of the last decade, because there was this sort of allegation that China was kind of subsidizing electric cars so that electric cars could be exported from China to Europe. And could be sold at, cheaper than maybe they should have been sold, and that this was kind of part of a big game to improve China's position in the global economy. So for many years, critics of globalization have usually come from the left, right? And so for the US to have been the country to tear up all of those agreements is quite fascinating. And, I mean, the headline of this article really goes to why, right? There was kind of this dream that the global world order could have been built around companies in the US doing all the intellectual work and sort of underdeveloped countries doing all the effectively grunt work of manufacture. The designed by Apple in California, made in China model. But effectively what happened is, as this article suggests, that China came and ate the West's lunch. Right? It actually got really good, not only at assembling goods, those kind of like really basic aspects of manufacture, not only the kind of horrible grunt work, but actually got pretty good at quite highly skilled manufacture. The number of companies that, particularly over the last kind of decade or so, we've seen more and more companies that are Chinese companies that you can buy goods from directly, or through a shop, but you can buy, but from Chinese companies in Europe and in the US, where the model was supposed to be that, Apple would be the company that would kind of design and profit from the goods. It would just be made in China. But increasingly what happened was that Chinese companies and the Chinese government kind of decided, well, why should we just manufacture the stuff and let a US-based or European-based company profit from it, when actually we could just be the company, right? And so you begin to see, your DJI drones, you begin to see hoverboards, like particularly electronics seem to have been one of the things that seem to have kind of really begun to get a foothold. Chinese electric cars, Huawei laptops and phones, and all of this has led to some concern among both European political leaders and American political leaders. And so effectively what happened was the US and Europe designed a system in which they could be the winners. And then China joined and has just reshaped the game. They decided that actually we don't just need to be the workshop of the world, we can also be the boardroom of the world. And so there's been concern about this across the board, right? A couple of years ago, 2022, Joe Biden actually expanded upon some of the tariffs that Trump had kind of set in place in his first term with the Chips and Science Act, which was effectively about making the US really good at making silicon chips, and had explicit rules about companies kind of American companies doing business in China, all of which kind of went sort of against that model of free trade. Some of this was like security related, or that was kind of how a lot of it was pitched. But the extent to which Trump has just decided to rip up the entire rulebook is quite impressive.